Thanks, Nathaniel, and thanks to the sponsors and co-panelists and to all of you for being here. We're all familiar with the statistics by now, the 2.2 million Americans behind bars, 58% of whom are people of color, the 5.9 million Americans who can't vote because of felon disenfranchisement, the 11% of African American children growing up with parents incarcerated, the 59% chance that a black man who doesn't finish high school will spend some time behind bars. But what do we do? How do we respond? That's a question that we ask ourselves. We might think, what are the policy solutions? How should we, what should we advocate for in Washington? Let's take the most extreme reforms we can imagine. Release all nonviolent drug offenders. End cash bail, so you're not behind bars because you can't, you don't have the money before your trial. Even more extreme, release every black person incarcerated right now. These huge, extreme, way beyond what anyone is talking about right now. We do all these three proposals, these extreme proposals, the prison population goes down by 50%, but we still have 1 million folks incarcerated. That's still an order of magnitude higher, both in numbers and in incarceration rate, than pure nations, 3 times higher than France, 4 times higher than Germany. This is after enacting the most extreme reforms that we can imagine. All of these reforms don't end mass incarceration. If we want to end mass incarceration, we need a different sort of framework, a different sort of approach to the issue. And what we want to think with you today about is whether that framework is prison abolition. If the prison is a moral abomination, we don't need to make it a nicer moral abomination. We need to get rid of the moral abomination. You might think, well, the prison is a necessary feature of American life. If it's always been here, it's always going to be there. But let's reflect for a moment on a certain period in American history in the early 1970s. We can think of this fellow Juan Morales, who was incarcerated in Wisconsin. It was a period of a lot of litigation around prisoners' rights. Morales brought an action against the federal government so that he could correspond with the woman he loved. The judge, this was a moment when it seemed as if the prison might be going away. The judge, the federal judge thought so as well. The federal judge thought, it's a little silly to have to adjudicate these little cases because, in a few years, there won't be any more prisons. The judge wrote, I am persuaded that the institution of prison probably must end. In many respects, it is as intolerable within the United States as was the institution of slavery, equally brutalizing to all involved, equally toxic to the social system, equally subversive of the brotherhood of man, even more costly by some standards, and probably less rational. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was book after book published, like The New Jim Crow, like Brian Stevenson's book that we talked about on campus a few weeks ago. It was a moment when even a Republican congressman, Stuart McKinney, was so suspicious of prisons that he decided to be locked up for a weekend to see what it was like. He came out 36 hours later saying, the prison is a big waste of money and human life. He told reporters, I can't see consigning any human being to this kind of existence. It seemed as if prison abolition might happen. Why did it fail? Well, that's a long story to tell with a lot of complicated reasons. One reason that we might posit is that there was a focus on policy reform to mitigate the prison. The tradition of abolitionism, the moral force of that tradition, went untapped. What is this tradition of abolitionism? Well, we might think back to the famous abolitionists of the 19th century, people like David Walker, John Brown, folks who were saying slavery is a moral abomination. Slavery runs against God's law. slavery must be put to an end. At first, these were one-off instances here and there, individuals speaking and taking action, but dismissed as marginal, as sort of oddballs, kind of crazy. But within a few decades, abolitionism had moved from the fringe to the mainstream in the North. Crowds would come to free those enslaved who were captured in the North and were going to be sent back to the South. Abolitionist organizations in small groups and newspapers sprung up throughout the North, spreading with a kind of Christian zeal. There was a political theology of abolitionism, the religious fervor and ritual and imagination mixed with the political fervor and zeal and imagination. And slavery came to an end. Of course, it's a complicated story. But if we just think about abolitionism as the movement that took place before the Civil War, we also miss something, because those abolitionists continued working after the Civil War. They continued through the era of Reconstruction, building the institutions, reweaving the social fabric to make life livable for those who had been enslaved. There was a positive project that went along with abolitionism and that continued even in the hard days after the end of Reconstruction, when the forces of white supremacy were shutting down black institutions throughout the South and throughout the nation. So I'd urge us to think of abolitionism not as a particular belief, but as a movement, as a social movement that grew from the early 19th century and continued through the 20th century, through Reconstruction, and continued, the abolitionist spirit continued in the civil rights movement, continued, we might even say, in the Black Power movement, continues in Black Lives Matter today. Sometimes it's called abolitionism, sometimes it goes by different names, but that abolitionist spirit continues. And it is always expressed in a political, theological vocabulary, one that mixes the Christian ideas and imagination with the political. We might name two dimensions of this movement. First, we might recall Mumia Abu-Jamal, the imprisoned Philadelphia journalist and prolific writer, says, quote, "Abolitionists are, simply put, those beings who look out upon their time and say no." Right? Say, instead of figuring out how can we make this injustice a little bit better, how can we fix this or that or tweak this or that, they say no, full stop, right? We have to imagine another world, right? We have to say no to the abominations that we encounter here. But together with that no, there's a yes, and Angela Davis, I think, is particularly persuasive in describing this, describing what she calls abolition democracy as a movement that took off after the end of slavery in the late 19th century and early 20th century. A building up of institutions and social structures, following what the Catholic tradition might call subsidiarity, right? Giving resources to those closest to problems in order to make these moral abominations unnecessary, whether they're the injustices of slavery or other injustices that followed from slavery in the era of white supremacy and beyond in our current era of mass incarceration. Whether these writers speak of it explicitly or not, there's always a religious dimension, a sense of a higher authority than the laws of the world invoked, and a sense of spirit pulling forward abolition movements. We can see this spirit, see this sense of a higher authority in abolition movements today in the prison strikes that have been the biggest prison strikes in history, in Georgia, in California, and in Alabama. And to just take one specific example, we might think of the Ordinary People's Society in Alabama, an organization led by the formerly incarcerated that helped to coordinate prison strikes across the country over the last couple of years. They call for the abolition of prisons, but they also offer job training programs, offer free meals, help register voters. They embrace both the no to the moral abomination and the yes to the building up of institutions that always goes with the abolitionist movements. But the Ordinary People's Society also includes Bible study, and its leader, Pastor Glasgow, Kenneth Glasgow is himself a pastor, had a religious epiphany when he was incarcerated that brought him not only to Jesus, but also to be an abolitionist. The two went hand in hand. But Pastor Glasgow makes it crucial to build, he doesn't put his Christianity in front of him, blocking off alliances. He says, quote, "We got to do it horizontal. We've got to bring everybody together across different religions, looking beyond barriers." Although he's motivated by his Christianity, although he sees himself part of an abolitionist political theological tradition, he wants to bring everyone, wherever they're coming from, whatever reasons they're coming to the table, together, building leadership from the grassroots. Let's learn how to respond to mass incarceration from those most affected, like Pastor Glasgow and those organizing with him. Let's learn from those leading the way, leading the movement at the grassroots. Let's learn from those what abolition means. Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks for being here. I am Kathryn Soltis. I've been thinking, researching, and teaching about prisons and punishment for a while, but more importantly, I've spent the better part of the last 20 years spending time with men and women who are incarcerated weekly, bi-weekly. In some capacities it's tutoring or teaching, but more often as a lay Catholic volunteer. And I served as actually the Catholic chaplain of a facility in Boston for several years. I'm honestly not sure when I became a prison abolitionist. I did not start that way, but I have arrived there. And so in my time today, what I want to do is speak on just a few topics. First is to say a couple words about why I think Christians, people of faith, but Christians especially, have a particular responsibility for responding to mass incarceration. Second, why I think an authentic account of Christian mercy and justice demand prison abolition. And then finally, I want to say a couple words at the end about recent theological developments in death penalty abolition and how they both do and do not provide us a path forward for prison abolition. So first on a Christian background. Why do we have a particular responsibility? Because we really helped create this monster as Christians and as people of faith. You know the words penitentiary, cell, those are religious words, right? Penitentiary first appeared 17th century Benedictine monk, Jean-Mabillon, and he described the monastic prisons as cells, right? These are practices of monastic discipline that involve separation, fasting. This was innovation from a religious imagination, right? Prison itself is an innovation, a recent one, right? Most of our history, prisons were places to hold people before you actually punish them, before you exact the physical, the corporal punishment, right? Usually in a public, gruesome way. But it was this humane innovation that we actually decided not to do that, but to make the imprisonment itself the punishment, right? This was good news for a time, it seemed. David Garland, famed sociologist in this work, notes that a lot of this innovation in terms of imprisonment comes from the medieval Roman Catholic Church, where you have ecclesiastical courts being developed, right? And you also have the cellular confinement, referred there earlier, the penitential discipline. These were models that came out of Christian, especially Catholic imagination. In fact, as late as the 18th century, Garland says, the Vatican prison served as a model for prison design in Europe and America. And the religious commitments of those who continue to work as reformers are clear. We have the Eastern State Penitentiary. I'm guessing many of you are familiar with this. The Quaker theological commitments there infused the work of the penitentiary, right? There was this commitment to moral conversion, to the inner life, right? And the inspectors of the Eastern State Penitentiary talked about how the inmates there, though fallen, they were still being touched by kindness, that they needed to return, repent, and live. The prison was built upon the structure of Christian notions of repentance and redemption. Right? So there may have been well-meaning and theological connections, but what we have created is a monstrosity, and so we have a particular responsibility to undo that and abolish. So, Christian mercy and justice. When we think about mercy, we oftentimes think that it is in opposition to justice. Justice is about getting the punishment that you deserve, paying your full debt, and mercy is about getting less than what you deserve, paying less than that, or maybe even canceling the debt altogether. That is not Christian mercy. Mercy in Christianity is extravagant and generous, but it is not opposed to justice. So to try to do this quickly for us, I want to go into the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I'm guessing many are familiar with. Jesus says, "Who is your neighbor?" The answer is the one who shows mercy. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan shows mercy because he finds this man who has been attacked by bandits, bloodied, bruised, in a ditch, left for dead. And he goes to him and he brings him back to life, right? He heals him, he nurses him, he gives up his resources. Go and do likewise, Jesus says. Well, as far as I can tell, the modern ditch where we leave people for dead is the prison. But you say, wait, most people in prison did something to deserve to be there, right? What do you know about this guy in the ditch from the parable? Do you know whether he deserved to be there? We don't know anything about him. Do you know he might be one of the bandits himself who cheated his friends there out of all the money that they had collected? And guess what? They turned on him, took it away, beat him up, and left him there. What if he's a scoundrel? A thief, just like the rest of them? We don't know that. And neither does the Good Samaritan. And he makes no attempt to find that out. He simply finds someone who's half dead and feels he has to bring him back to life. What if, in bringing this man back to life, nursed back to health, this guy goes back to his thieving and victimizing ways? It's possible. Mercy. Bring the half-dead back to life. Go and do likewise. The distinctive feature of mercy is not that it is unwarranted, undeserved, but what it intends to do, to bring the half-dead back to life, and not make that contingent on whether it's deserved or not. Mercy is about such a profound commitment to liberation, healing, restoration, that commitment will not be undermined by innocence or guilt. So, thinking about Christian mercy in these terms, let's think about the prison a little bit. I want to just make a couple quick points about what I think the prison is at essence and why it cannot stand ethically. The prison demonizes people who have already been abandoned. It is institutionalized hopelessness. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Society, we have already given up on young black men, traumatized, addicted women, the poor, the mentally ill, and the list goes on and on. Of course, these individuals will find their way to a place where we have institutionalized hopelessness. We have already given up on them. And hopelessness is opposed to life. Hopelessness is a vice, right? Even Brian Stevenson, when he was here, talked about that hopelessness was opposed to justice. Here's another problem with the prison. It perpetuates the myth of permissible marginalization. We, or many of us, believe that humans are social in nature, that our flourishing as individuals is related to, dependent upon, interdependent with the flourishing of the community. We have a concept in Catholic social teaching about the common good. It's not utilitarianism. It means that people cannot be sacrificed without injuring the community itself, right? So often we have very individualist accounts of what happens in imprisonment. You lose freedoms and rights. No, the fundamental loss is about social death. It is about separation from community and relationships. It is about devastating deprivation of those kinds of relationships that we need for flourishing in the common good. There is no permissible marginalization. here's another problem I have. The grave danger of prison is that we see it as a postscript to justice. It's actually not part of justice, though we might have lip service to the contrary. I think that we see justice in the courtroom. I think we want to know that there's a correct verdict and that there's a proper sentencing, a proper application of deserved negative consequences. What happens in prison does not seem to have a bearing on whether we think justice has been served. Imagine if you went to someone at the courtroom doors and asked them, this person was guilty, they were given 10 to 15 years in prison, and you ask them, do you feel like justice has been served? And they say to you, well, I don't know, I have to see what's going to happen over the next 10 to 15 years. Deep down, I don't think we really believe that imprisonment has to do with justice. All right, and a couple words about justice. Pope Francis had a lovely papal audience on justice and mercy, and he said, true justice must conquer evil, not merely keep it in check. You don't conquer evil by oppressing people. It's evil. But by liberating them. The essence of biblical justice is about a saving intervention, a transformation. Scripture doesn't talk about justice as about the wicked getting what's coming to them. Wicked are held to account, but that's not what justice. Justice is always an intervention of saving that's done on behalf of those who are suffering, who are downtrodden. That's the only way it's sensible to say that God does justice with God's mercy, which is what we say. Mercy and justice in an authentic Christian account are not opposed. I do not deny that humans are capable of horrendous and gruesome harms against one another. But as an abolitionist, what I deny, or what I reject, is imprisonment, because I believe it is among the truly horrendous and gruesome things that we can do to harm one another. Ultimately, I think this question really comes down to whether we agree with Pope Francis or not when he says, the Lord of mercy wants to save everyone. Everyone. Do you buy it or not? Finally, a couple words about death penalty and prison abolition. On August 1st of this year, announcement was made that Pope Francis revised paragraph 2267 of the Catechism to say that no matter how serious the crime that has been committed, the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and the dignity of the person. There are a lot of commonalities between death penalty and prison at large, right? Cruelty, the fact that it is applied outrageously unequally, the fact that innocent people may be there incorrectly, and the fact that we doubt the efficacy many times of both the death penalty and imprisonment. But we often point to some differences between these two. Why should we treat death penalty as a separate issue? Well, the death penalty is irreversible. You cannot bring this person back once you've killed them. I'm not really convinced that irreversibility is that distinctive. Tell a child whose father has been incarcerated for 10 years that those 10 years are reversible. The other way that I think we sometimes differentiate these is that we say that death penalty, there are other ways to keep people safe, there are other ways to defend society. But prison, there are no other ways. We can't imagine any alternatives. This is how we keep people safe. And this is a fundamental issue of imagination and our resignation to inevitability, right? Prisons were an innovation, and they've come up gravely short. We need another innovation. Prison is not inevitable. But let's see, is there hope in this death penalty abolition, or inadmissibility at least, right, that we have? It shows us development, that new sensibilities are possible, that what we thought we needed as a society, maybe we don't actually need. And it points us to the rigorous demands of human dignity, right? And I hope that one day we have a concept of human dignity, not only that disallows killing as a form of punishment, but a concept of dignity that rejects institutionalized hopelessness and the myth of permissible marginalization. But here's a missed opportunity, I think, and I'll conclude with this, that in the 90s, John Paul II revised the Catechism and said that much of what was already there in terms of the death penalty position, that if non-lethal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to such means, as these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. The concrete conditions of the common good and the dignity of the human person. These two aspects demand this. But in the most recent revision that Pope Francis has given us, he talks about the inviolability and the dignity of the person, but does not bring back the language of the common good. The death penalty still in this announcement is treated in a different ethical frame than punishment. It's about whether or not we can have legitimate killing. It is not about the fundamental ethical realities of punishment. And there's still a lot of confusion about punishment, and I think too much emphasis on the issue of innocence and guilt, which isn't in the Good Samaritan prayer. So what I think we need is a development of dignity that's not just about whether we can kill or not, but extends to the common good. Can the common good afford to exclude a person? It can't. Pope Francis misses that opportunity when he leans on dignity language exclusively. The prison may not kill, like the death penalty, or kill as efficiently, but it imposes hopelessness, which is opposed to life. And the prison may not foreclose the possibility of return, but it is a grave offense against the common good, against justice, and against mercy. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. So today I'm going to, well, I say like Professor Getek Soltis, I myself did not come out of the womb as a prison abolitionist. I'm actually kind of at the beginning of this journey, maybe only like 1 or 2 years. And I think one of the biggest obstacles to, becoming a part of the prison abolition movement or just converting to it in your own mind is it seems impossible, right? You might agree with it. Yes, there's something wrong here. I feel something's off about people being incarcerated, but A, how could society function without it, right? I think the really, really bad guys and girls who do, the most heinous crimes, we got to put them somewhere, right? We might think of those cases. We also might think it's impossible in the sense of, how can this ever be more than a fringe movement? In other words, how can this ever be more than something that just a few people are on board with, right? It might seem hopeless. The cause of prison abolition might seem hopeless. And I want to kind of give us some hope that is not only not the case, but that we might actually be kind of at the beginning of a new historical moment, not just in society in general, but in the Catholic Church, right, in terms of Catholic moral imagination. And I'm going to do that by saying that within society in general, and Catholic teaching in particular, we have already undergone a change at least as dramatic on one occasion, and not too far ago, and that's on the issue of slavery. It wasn't just in the United States or other parts of the Americas where slavery was considered to be good or at least permissible, but for almost all of the Catholic Church's history, slavery was considered to be okay, either acceptable or in some cases a positive moral good. Now, not in all cases. In fact, the Catholic Church used to think about slavery the way most of us today think about prison. In other words, it's just if the person deserves it, right? Or it's just if the person was legally enslaved, right? There were certain rules. Catholic Church never thought it was okay to enslave just any random person, just as today, I don't think anyone thinks it's okay to just incarcerate anyone, right? But most people think if you did the crime, you gotta pay the time. There's a similar view in the Catholic moral imagination about slavery. So, but the other reason I want to draw this comparison is that, this isn't a coincidence, right? The slavery and the prison, or slavery and criminality or criminalization in general, share a lot in common, right? They're not the same. I'm not equating them. I don't think incarceration is the same as slavery, but they are very similar, and that's because slavery kind of gave birth to prison, or to modern concepts of criminality, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit here in a second. So again, but basically what I want to say is if we could change our minds on slavery, not only can we change our minds on prison and criminalization in general, but maybe we should, right? Given the similarities I'm going to lay out. All right. So, and feel free in the Q&A to ask more about these, because I'm kind of just going to run through them because we don't have time to go into depth. But especially if you're skeptical, maybe I'm just making this up, please feel free to ask about it. So the first thing that slavery and prison that they have in common is something called natal alienation. And that just basically means society does not recognize family ties, right? Enslaved people not only didn't have the right to their family members, they weren't also really able to fulfill their obligations to their family members. We could just think of something when an enslaver or a slave master could sell a child away from their parents, right? Today, in our society, if a parent has rights, you can't just take a kid from a child without due process, right? Not the case with an enslaved person, right? The master ultimately owns the children, right? Same thing, marriage relationships. When a person's incarcerated, it's similar, right? They don't have the full rights to a family life like you and I do, or they get access to their family members, with the permission of the prison. The prison runs the show, right? Okay. Another thing prison and slavery have in common: social death. We've already heard it. Just quite simply, an enslaved person in prison, they do not have the full rights of citizens. I mean, very few of them. Again, enslaved people really, they existed in society. They were recognized as a member of society kind of, again, only through their master. Someone who's in prison, I think only in like Vermont and only 1 or 2 states are they allowed to vote, right? And most states keep people from voting even after they've been released from prison for a certain period of time. That's an example of social death. Even just the fact that like they're assigned a number. It's hard for imprisoned people to sue, like if their guard is mistreating them or the prison is mistreating them, if the prison is not granting them the rights they do have, they have limited access to like an attorney even. It's almost like the prison has to help them sue them, right? Does that make sense? I mean, that's an example of social death. Also, like slaves, and this isn't just, again, I'm talking about slavery at all times in all places, right? This isn't just slavery that existed in the United States, but like enslaved people, people who are in prison are subject to extraordinarily high rates of sexual violence. Way above and beyond people outside prison are subject to high rates of sexual violence. We're becoming more aware of that as a society. It's much worse for incarcerated people. And this isn't just from other inmates, it's from guards, but also it's some things that are considered to be routine and necessary parts of prison life, right? Think about it. A strip search. An inmate can't say no to that. Body cavity searches. Things like maybe they have to take a shower under supervision. We don't even think of these things as sexual violence. That kind of proves my point, right? We don't even think of them as having the right to say no. My body's my own. Their body's not their own. Much in the same way an enslaved person's body is not their own. And both groups of people are subject to high rates of what we might call non-sexual violence. Again, not just by other inmates, but from guards. It's a routine part of prison life. An inmate who disobeys an order, like a slave who disobeys an order, they deserve to be punished physically with violence, right? That's seen as something, it's not the prison's fault, it's the inmate's fault, right? They brought it on themselves. So even the rationales by which violence against enslaved people was justified, similar rationales justify violence against incarcerated people. And then think about it, right? Inmates, incarcerated people like enslaved people, they're captives. Like literally they're captives. We could think of arrest as legal kidnapping, right? People are like taken and put somewhere that they don't want to be in. They're in cages, shackles, right? All sorts of similar restraining devices. Another thing they have in common, incarcerated people like slaves are put into or rendered into a false or artificial state of dependence, right? Like inmates are dependent upon the prison for their food, for clothes, right? They're not allowed to, they don't have a right to, to make a living for themselves, just like enslaved people, right? They were rendered dependent upon the master. And of course that would further justify slavery. Oh look, these people can't fend for themselves, what will they do? That was something you heard, kind of the benevolent case for slavery back in the day, right? Well, enslaved people can't fend for themselves. Where would they be without the benevolence and mercy of the master, right? We might think the same way of incarcerated people. They're rendered helpless, okay? And now this is a particular case of the United States and other countries, in the Americas. Both slavery and prison are anti-black, right? They're racist. And again, as with the connection between slavery and prison in general, that's not a historical coincidence, okay? So let's talk about that historical connection real quick. Let's do the general, and then we'll do the specific, right? The general, being the world at large, the specific being the United States. So in medieval Europe, for example, slavery was a punishment for crime. Well, specific crimes, capital crimes, right? Crimes that you ordinarily would get the death penalty for, you'd be executed for. And interestingly, and this in itself is very interesting given the topic of this, that was considered merciful. If someone was a murderer or a rapist or whatever, there were a lot more crimes that were considered capital crimes back then. They deserved death. Well, the society or the community was being merciful by just enslaving them. So slaves, and people were in a sense, they were thought to feel lucky. You should be grateful that we spared your life, right? Interestingly, okay? And then over time, as European history continues and in colonial America, slavery wasn't so much a punishment for crime anymore, but a lot of the punishments that were uniquely reserved for slaves were, put on criminals. So like whippings, any form of corporal punishment. And some countries still around the world still punish criminals with corporal punishment, right? We do that because that's how we punish slaves. So there was this kind of like symbolic link forged between a slave, the punishment that a slave deserves, and a punishment that a criminal deserves. And then so now if we turn just to the case of the United States, after slavery was abolished, well, I guess I should say too, the thing about slavery in the United States, right, it wasn't just that only black people were enslaved. That's true. But it did something else. There was an association formed between blackness and black people and slavery, right? So once slavery ended, many people in this country still were very much committed to the notion that black people should be held into or should remain in some form of slave-like state, right? That association continued. And given these kind of parallels or similarities between slavery and prison, we shouldn't be surprised looking back, right? Although, as Professor Lloyd said, history could have been otherwise, right? Could have been otherwise. But looking back, it's not surprising that people who were very invested in anti-black racism, that one of the ways they kept this association alive, the association between blackness and slave status, was through criminalization, right? So in other words, in disproportionately criminalizing black people, it was a way to basically preserve white supremacy and stem the tide of Reconstruction. Okay, and of course, that's a whole interesting history, right? The history of the criminal justice system. But we don't have time to go into that right now. And again, okay, so that's kind of like a secular, and just quickly, the Catholic Church too, very much on board with the kind of general connection between, or the kind of general defenses of slavery, right? So just quickly. In the medieval era, going back again, and before that, leading Catholic theologians, people like Thomas Aquinas, right, you may have heard of, or St. Augustine, going back to the ancient time period, right, way before. They thought that slavery was unnatural in the sense it was not a part of God's plan for humanity, but they thought that it was a necessary and proper consequence of the fall. In other words, it was a reaction to sin. Now, our modern ears, we might think, oh, is there some sort of, that's like the slave master's sin, right? No, the sin of enslaved people. So you see, there was still this connection between crime and sin are different, but there's a connection, right? That slavery is a punishment for doing bad things. Thomas Aquinas, again, he not only did he think slavery was an appropriate punishment for sin, but also he thought it was an expression of hierarchy. He thought it was fitting that, I think his quote was, that the less wise should be ruled by the wiser. And we can think about how we have parallels to that justification for the prison today, right? We think, well, these people need help getting their lives back on track, or they can't govern themselves, they make bad decisions when they're on the outside or whatever, and on and on. And then just quite simply, we think, just as Catholic tradition did for centuries, we think some people simply deserve to be in prison. So the fact that it's a terrible place doesn't bother us, because we're like, well, yeah, that's the point, right? Prison should be miserable. Okay. Anyways, and I also want to point out too how recent this change is in Catholic tradition, especially for different reasons. The Catholic tradition was kind of a little bit later to jump on the slavery abolition bandwagon than some other groups. So really this change in Catholic teaching from being against slavery in certain circumstances to being against slavery in all circumstances really didn't start till like the middle of the 19th century, the late 19th century, and it wasn't really completed until the Second Vatican Council, which was like the 1960s. That's when, for the first time, you know, in authoritative official Catholic teaching, it was written, slavery's always wrong. There's no justification for it ever. Okay. So, of course, by the 1960s, most of the rest of the world had already come to that conclusion a few decades ago, so we didn't even realize how revolutionary that was. When we look at the scope of church history, like, wow, that's at least as big of a change as the one we're advocating for today. And then my last thing here. So now this seems like obvious. I mean, it's funny, something that seems necessary to the preservation of order and hierarchy, protection of the innocent, and I'm talking about slavery, now seems, how could people ever justify that, right? To us, it's like, it's hard to even get in someone's head to think of how they could have thought slavery was okay. And from the Catholic perspective now, the Catholic Church basically says, doesn't have any long, flowery arguments against slavery. It's pretty obvious. It just says slavery violates human dignity. Period. Doesn't matter what the person did. Like, we would be offended, you know, Catholic Church, from the Catholic perspective and our perspective, somebody's a murderer, we don't think they should be enslaved, right? There's no good reason to enslave someone anymore in our minds, right? I know there is slavery that still happens, right? But at least in our level, when we're thinking morally, right? So what I want to say is, not only are these big monumental changes possible, but I want us to think about, given these similarities between slavery and prison, both, you know, materially, what they actually are, but the way we thought about slavery and the way we could think about prison, I want to ask you, what is the difference? I think the key question we might want to think about is, what makes prison different from slavery, such that one is always wrong, slavery, and the other, prison, is not just sometimes okay, but actually morally good, right? So in other words, how can slavery always be in violation of human dignity and prison not be, right? I'm increasingly skeptical that you can say one is always wrong without saying the other is, right? So I'll just leave you all with that. That's all I got.